We always say the nose knows. And if you have, you know, 3 different cultivations out in front of you and you don't know which one to choose, pick the one that smells the best to you.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by all the options at your local dispensary? Should you use more CBD or THC? How about some CBG? Which terpenes will augment your experience? Should you try dry herb, edibles, or maybe a topical cream? Don't worry, we've got some help. Andrea Sparr-Jaswa has been teaching people about cannabis for years. She's a bud tender and educator who can help you discover the right compounds and intake methods. Now, she'll tell her story of coming into the cannabis world and how you can navigate it yourself. I hope you enjoy. I'm pleased to be here with Andrea Sparr-Jaswa, who is the Director of Education at Farma. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now you're educator at one of the finest cannabis shops in the country, but that's not where you started off. So how did you get to here?
Yeah, so it's, like everybody else, a bit of a journey. I started off in school for art and architectural history, kind of had the idea that I would go that direction into academia and pursue graduate studies in that realm, and ended up graduating college finally right around the time the economy crashed, and that kind of put a damper on pursuing higher education. So I was kind of just waiting for the next opportunity, and in that time became familiar with cannabis in a way that I had never been before. It was never a part of my life in any sort of strong capacity until I hit 30, and just had a really wonderful experience one time with an edible that a friend had made. I know not everybody can say that, and I've had plenty of bad edible experiences too at this point. But that sort of got my mind thinking that I really enjoyed that kind of intoxication over other types of intoxication. I also found that it helped with anxiety and depression when I kept it at low doses. I started using it in baking, had a whole side business, and was seeing variations in effects, even though my batches, were the same, every single time in terms of dosing. I was seeing differences of effects between batches, and I wanted to know why. So I just started looking into what that could be. Certainly a part of that is potency, as other compounds are heated off. But, I was in my head, I was thinking, okay, well, maybe there's something to do with these terpenes, all of these aromatic components found in cannabis that was also helping to differentiate the effects. And so that just got me kind of going down a rabbit hole of research, and made me realize that maybe cannabis was the place that I wanted to be, and the direction that I wanted to go in terms of this new burgeoning industry. Colorado had just come online, or was just about to come online when I started getting into this. I'm like, oh, I'm going to start a bakery in Colorado, and I'm going to serve I'm going to have tea, and you can buy an adult cupcake. But of course, that's not how it played out. And so my search continued, and I came across Farma and was introduced to a number of folks who were working there, including Emma Chasen, and just really hit it off. And I knew that it was the right choice. It was going to give me the opportunity to get my hands into everything. It was a science-focused, education-focused dispensary, unlike anybody else was doing at that point, to my knowledge. Certainly with any sort of great efficacy. And they were really out there spreading the message, and I wanted to be a part of that. So I moved myself out to Oregon almost 3 years ago in September, and started working there as a bud tender. I became a buyer pretty quickly. We were doing, more private consults. And then when Emma left, took over outreach and education in conjunction with another person for about a year. And then when she left, I became the director of education. So A little bit of a process, but it was, looking back, it's funny how things sort of just aligned to make it work. And they did. They really did.
And congratulations on the position. It's a great
Thank
spot to be
you.
doing it.
It's so amazing.
And before we go into all the science that they focus on there, the basics are often the hardest part for people. And so how would you explain this plant to a grandmother who's walking through your door for the first time and is new to this whole cannabis thing?
Sure. When I'm engaging with somebody coming into the dispensary who has zero knowledge of it, that can still go in a couple different directions. Either they're super curious and interested in some intoxication, or they're really just looking to treat symptoms and they're really they're not interested in intoxication at all for one reason or another. So that's certainly the first question that we're asking is just are you comfortable with intoxication? Have you tried anything before? Has it worked for you? Do you know what your edible dose is? If you've ever tried anything, if you've ever had a bad experience in the past, and then kind of go from there. More often than not, we're talking about high CBD products, CBD rich products rather, to start folks off on, especially if they're looking for symptomatic treatment. We don't really carry anything that's isolated CBD. Everything is more full spectrum, but we certainly have products that have very, very low levels of THC, and then, obviously topicals as well, which I still think are really hands down one of the best ways to introduce grandma to the healing effects of cannabis. I mean, especially somebody who's hesitant because they've been told their entire lives that it's something that they should avoid, that it's been illegal for so long and they're just concerned about the legality of it, or, maybe they're on medications, or they're don't want the high associated with any sort of cannabis product. Topicals are a great way to treat something site specifically, near immediately. And especially with the older crowds, you see a lot of arthritic conditions, and it's incredibly beneficial. So that's always a go-to of a great way to sort of introduce people to what cannabis can do, where they can see effects almost immediately if they're going to see them. And then just start spreading the word to all of their friends, which helps to destigmatize the plant, which also helps them trust the plant more. And maybe they come back and they're like, last time I didn't want any THC, but you said that THC generally makes CBD a little bit more effective. Let's go ahead and try some. Let's just keep it really low. And suddenly you have somebody who's a new convert. Not that this is some sort of, religion by any means, but it really does change people's lives. And when, you get to watch somebody come in who was hesitant before and now can use their hand for the first time in years, or who has slept an entire night for the first time in years, it's just absolutely incredible.
Wow. That's great. And it's a bit of a religion. Everything is.
It's true. It's true.
And for those people who are naive to THC, what's your biggest advice to them on how to handle that?
I mean, certainly the start low and go slow method and mantra is of utmost importance to, tell everyone. And that's to anybody coming in. Everybody is a little bit different. What a low dose to one person is a high dose to another. We generally tell people if they are looking for intoxication, even a light intoxication, most people feel comfortable between 2.5 and 15 milligrams of THC. In Oregon, we have no higher than 5 milligrams of THC per dose. So we're already on the low end of that, but we'll even take it a step further and say, hey, let's just do this single milligram of THC. Let's start with this 2.5 milligrams of THC. And let's add some CBD in there as well to help mitigate any sort of negative side effects, to decrease the likelihood of an anxious response, to keep the THC from binding as tightly to the receptors so that just the high doesn't seem as intense. Generally speaking, we're looking at mixed ratio CBD-rich products, and just adding in THC with titration until they feel comfortable.
And then for ingestion methods, how do you describe how the various ones feel and the pros and cons of them to someone who wants to try these out?
Sure. Well, inhalants are awesome for their near immediate efficacy. Very quickly, how you're going to feel. Within 15 minutes or so, you can decide if you want to take another hit. And the effects are a little bit shorter lived as well. So you have a little bit more leniency there in terms of being able to kind of come back to it, maintain a sort of consistent level of intoxication if you're looking for it, or pain relief if you're looking for it, without ever pushing over into an uncomfortable realm. That being said, especially when you're talking about something like flower, unless you're vaporizing it at a really low temperature, with combustion, you're burning off some of those more volatile compounds that also have therapeutic benefit, and B, you're just combusting the material, which isn't great, period, and certainly not great for folks who might have a compromised immune system or some sort of bronchio condition, bronchial condition. That avoiding that is wise. Is in terms of edibles. Your body's digesting them. It's why it takes so long for them to kick in. So there's that to be considered, just the time of how long it's going to take to kick in. Do you need something for acute symptoms? If you need something for acute symptoms, then you're looking at something more like an inhalant or a topical, or maybe even some sort of oral mucosal spray that gets into the mucous membranes and hits a little bit faster without getting gets into the bloodstream a little bit faster without having to wait fully for digestion. And then there's also the idea of metabolism too, right? So you're going to get, you have delta 9 THC when you're smoking. It's what most people are familiar with. You're also getting 11 hydroxy THC as it metabolizes. That metabolism increases when you're eating something, when you're digesting something, and you're getting a lot more of the 11 hydroxy THC, which is, you're losing some in the digestion component of it, but that particular molecule is significantly more potent for most people. So then you're looking at a much more intense high. So, again, just starting at a very low dose, waiting at least a couple hours, especially if you've eaten a big meal, waiting even a little bit longer before you go in to take a second dose. And really, keeping a journal. Absolutely. I mean, we can tell you everything we know about the science out there associated with the individual compounds, because honestly, most of the science is around individual compounds right now, and generally, they're isolated compounds at very high doses, not mini human studies. Most of them are still in rodents. So, all of that has to be taken into consideration. So ultimately, it really does have to be a personal journey, and only you are going to be able to know what works for you and what doesn't. And by keeping a good journal, by just jotting down how you feel after you consume a particular dose or a particular product, were you feeling pain before? Are you feeling pain now? What kind of mood were you in? Have you had a lot of water that day? Like, all of those are considerations in terms of like how you might feel even after a single product that can change day to day depending on what else your body is going through. So just keeping a good journal and a personal record so that you can make the right choices for your personal preferences.
That's great advice, because it is so different for everybody, and it's one of the
Absolutely.
most annoying parts for doctors or medical professionals working around this is we're gonna have to see what works for you.
But see, that's part of the problem too, is that, for so long we've had, this idea of pharmacology as this single compound, single target ideal. And we have to stop thinking like that. I mean, there is a place for that for sure. And it's important that we understand how isolated CBD or isolated THC or isolated terpenes interact in the body. But that's not the reality of the plant. It's not the reality of the products that are produced for the most part, at least outside of big pharma. And even within, you have something like Sativex, which is an extraction and a mixed ratio extraction, which has shown a lot of great efficacy for folks and has done a really great things and is now part of, clinical trials, which is wonderful to see as well.
And to go back to the ingestion methods, you probably get to see a lot of new crazy ideas out there for how to get cannabis into your system. Is there anything that's intriguing coming out that you think is an interesting new method?
There's a lot of talk about like nanotechnology. I honestly don't know a ton about it. It's not something that I see in terms of product availability right now, so it hasn't been a huge focus. Certainly, the idea that certain terpenes, certain aromatic compounds, can increase bioavailability, especially during digestion, like citral monoterpenes. Like limonene are often added to things like transdermal patches or tinctures and infusions that you're taking orally, and that has shown some evidence that increases bioavailability in through digestion specifically, which you're losing a lot through the digestive process otherwise, but then again that might make the product stronger. So there's some caution there as well.
And speaking of terpenes, you write about something called predictive analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering if you would explain that and how it relates to terpenes.
Sure. So at the shop, long before I got there, what we were doing was taking full spectrum lab data. So, getting especially particularly in relationship to flower to bud, not only getting data for THC and CBD content, but also at least a few of the most prominent minor cannabinoids present, and then all of the terpenes, all of your aromatic compounds present, at least the ones that they're able to read right now, right? There's so many more than that are probably there. Not to mention esters and alcohols and other things that we're not measuring for. So, it's still a little bit more of an art than a science, but at least it starts to give a basis for understanding how something might work better for you. So we take all of the terpenes and the cannabinoids and we kind of weigh them up against each other. We have Dr. Russo's work on terpenes, looking at the research that's out there, his work in cannabis pharmacology, the usual suspects and a few promising leads, covers a large array of different terpenes and their known effects within the body. Again, isolated from other compounds that we are now putting together or seeing together in cannabis. So all of this with a grain of salt. But, if you have say something that is terpenylene rich. So terpenylene shows up, it's an aromatic compound that has a really lovely sort of sweet, citrusy, piney scent. It's unmistakable if you smell something like a Durban poison or some sort of Dutch varietal, haze varietal. You often have this very pungent terpenylene scent coming off of it. And it's a citral monoterpene that does tend to show up in pretty high numbers in things that would generally be considered quote unquote a sativa. So they are, associated with more stimulating, activating, cerebrally engaging highs that can be transformative and even kind of trippy, but also can be a little much for some people. It can really be a little bit more of a journey than people are wanting to go on sometimes. Definitely a little bit more activating than calming. So for maybe not the end of the night, not the best choice. But something like that, if I see that in a high percentage, especially near the top of a terpene report, depending on what other terpenes are next to it, I can kind of start to look at how that particular chemovarietal is likely to affect the general public. I mean, of course, there are going to be exceptions to every rule. Folks who have been diagnosed with ADHD are often kind of switched on the spectrum. So for most people, something is energizing. For them, it's more relaxing. So there are always exceptions to that. But at least we start to get an idea. And then you have, we have a case of 24 different chemovars on the shelf. The bud tenders don't have to try every single last strain on the shelf to know, have an idea of how it might affect somebody. and be able to talk about it, which, keeping up with the case can be kind of tricky. So with something like terpenylene, when I see that in a high percentage, I know that for most people, this is going to be a fairly stimulating high. In part, it looks like, terpenylene specifically engages with the serotonin receptor 5-HT2A, which is also the same receptor that a lot of hallucinogenic drugs engage with. And, that could be in part why you're getting sort of a trippy head high from that for most people. And if I know that, then I can make a better prediction about that. If somebody comes in, saying that they have had a Durban poison in the past, but they, don't know what to pick this time because it's no longer on the shelf. Now I know that they enjoyed a terpenylene-rich cultivation, and I can find something else on the shelf that might work well for them as well. So even if we're not telling a single soul about what the individual compounds may or may not do for them, just having the data in front of them, having a list of the ingredients, of the main ingredients in any particular varietal, is going to allow somebody to walk into a shop, if that data is available, and choose something that they think works best for them based on their previous experiences, whether or not they know a single strain name in the case or not. And if they don't have that data, if they can start to recognize scent profiles that they enjoy, they can also go into a shop and say, hey, this smells exactly like this other thing that I really enjoyed. Maybe it's going to work for me. And so suddenly, what was a daunting choice now gets narrowed down to maybe one or two choices, and they're more likely to find something that's going to work for them again.
Wow. It's a lot more daunting for new people to have these more molecules at play.
Exactly. But that's the thing too, just like, you always hear people say that, your body craves what you need. We always say the nose knows. And if you have, 3 different cultivations out in front of you, and you don't know which one to choose, pick the one that smells the best to you. Maybe that is the right choice. Maybe it's not, but it's a good choice, a good place to start.
I've been writing about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system for years. I've traveled the world to gather people's stories about cannabis and the history of our use of it. But at the time, the positive effects from CBD were only starting to dawn on me. Then I saw firsthand the impact it made in the health of my cousin, and the comfort it gave my grandmother as she was passing. Since then, the many accounts I've heard from those using CBD from hemp made me a believer in its potential. CV Sciences works hard to produce the highest quality hemp supplements, so people everywhere can experience CBD's benefits for themselves. I'm proud to be working with them to help spread the good work. Proud because I know we lead the industry in research and education. Proud because I know we make excellent CBD supplements from true agricultural hemp. But I'm most proud because I know our products make a difference in people's lives. At pluscbdoil.com, use the coupon code LEXFILES for 20% off to see for yourself.
And on that note, you also write about the ideal ingredient label for cannabis products.
Mm-hmm.
What would you design if you could design the very best cannabis ingredient label?
Based off of the data that we have now, I would, certainly have your major cannabinoids, your THC and CBD content, and then minor cannabinoids. Right now, you're generally not seeing labs test for more than 5 minor cannabinoids at any given time. There are 100 more. But just the big ones. So at least people can start to see, again, what kind of intoxication they're likely to feel, if you're going to have enough CBD content in there to help to lessen the likelihood of a negative THC experience, if you want something more CBD rich with a really low THC content. And then beyond that, especially when you're talking about something like flower, or concentrates, having at least, I would say, the top 5 terpenes available. I mean, there are things that show up in trace amounts. For instance, there is a compound called carine, and it doesn't generally show up in any sort of high concentration, but when it does show up, it's almost always indicative of a more sort of tight, heady high. It's a fairly astringent compound. It's oftentimes in the same sort of flower varietals that you would associate with like a terpenylene-rich cultivation, like your Durbans and Dutches and such. So, there are minor cannabinoids or minor terpenes there that would maybe, I would love to see that listed as well. But I think if we at least had the top 5 terpenes, you can at least start to see how things balance against each other. Something that's super myrcene dominant. Myrcene is also found in hops. It's associated with a more sedative intoxication. A lot of people associate it with a sort of couch lock effect, but to be honest, I don't think that's true. When I see it in a really high concentration, in a far disparate ratio from other more minor terpenes in a particular batch of flower. We had a Maui Wowie come through recently that has a really high level of myrcene, but all the other compounds are a lot more minimal in comparison. And when I see that, especially after doing these data analyses over and over again, I can start to recognize patterns. And I know that in the past, when I see such a disparate ratio, almost always, at least from my personal experience, and as I kind of talk to people, it tends to be a calming high for sure, but it still stays pretty lucid. It's not as heavy and stony as people would make myrcene out to be. It's when you start to see things like heavy concentrations of linalool, which is also found in lavender, and it has amazing analgesic properties that rival morphine and opioids, or combinations, near equal combinations of myrcene and limonene. I know that's going to be like a stony euphoria for most people. So it's not just the single top terpene that you're looking at. It's at least the top 3 that you're kind of comparing against one another and deciding, okay, is this going to push more into a heady, stimulating experience, or is it going to push into a more relaxed, numbing experience, more of an analgesic sort of effect for most people? And so by having at least those top 5 terpenes, I think you can have a better idea of which way something is going to lean for you based on what it's done in the past for you.
That's great. Though it must be tough having people coming in, all their different reactions to all of these.
Sure, but you actually see a decent amount of consistency. I mean, yeah, everybody responds differently to every single thing, but there's more similarity than there are differences. And again, it really comes back to just being able to provide. You wouldn't go to the grocery store and be able to find the right thing unless there were ingredient labels on there. What if you were allergic to gluten and you didn't know if it was in there? What if you were looking for something very specific, like I don't know, ginseng or something, or ginger. You want something for good digestion. Well, if the ingredients aren't there, then you don't know what you're picking. So we have to start giving people the ability to check the ingredients just like they do at the grocery store, because ultimately this isn't just about how something is just going to taste. It's also about how it's going to affect them, both psychologically and physiologically. It's more important than something at the grocery store in many ways. So until we start to see standardized lab reports, so that we're getting consistent data from state to state and company to company, so that people can reliably tell if those numbers are correct. And until we're putting that data on every single product that it's relevant to, it's just going to be difficult for people to make good choices for themselves unless they have, a local dispensary or someone who can help walk them through that.
And speaking of the future with all of these different compounds in the plant, what do you think are going to be some of the ones that get focused on the next at the consumer level? Whether it be CBG or some of the other terpenes or other parts of the plant?
CBG is going to be a big one. So, rather than labeling things indica and sativa, there's a bit of a push towards type 1, type 2, type 3. So type 1 cultivations are THC rich, generally have, less than 3% CBD, almost no CBD most of the time anymore in terms of what people are growing these days. Type 2 are your mixed ratio, so lower individual percentages of THC and CBD, maybe like 10% and 10% or 8% and 17, but more evenly balanced, allowing for intoxication, but with a bit more control, often a little bit more body focused, although I would argue that some of that is just based off the cultivations that are being used to create them, which ultimately have more relaxing compounds in them right now. That will change as people continue to create new and exciting cultivations. And then you have type 3. So that's all of your minimal THC content. You're looking at generally less than maybe like 3% THC, certainly CBD rich. But then you have type 4. And type 4 is a CBG rich plant. So CBG is the sort of stem cell cannabinoid that all of the others synthesize from. And by turning off the enzymatic reaction during growth, there is actually a way to keep the CBG from developing into something else. And so then you end up with all the way to flower, and you end up with a CBG rich cultivation. Reportedly, there is also a type 5, and there's no literature about this. I haven't seen it, but it would be a cannabinoid null plant. So no major cannabinoid production, just terpenes. Very fascinating. I'll be eager to see what goes on with that. But the CBG is definitely up and coming, and it's going to probably be the next sort of CBD wave, I would guess.
Okay, that's exciting.
Yeah. And then in terms of terpenes, terpenylene is a really big one right now. I work with Jeremy Plum, who is the director of science at Science and Production at Groundworks for our in-house grow proof cultivar. And he has always had a passion for looking for terpenylene-rich chemovars, very specifically because of, the sort of mind-expanding head high that it's capable of giving, B, its relationship to serotonin, and being able to possibly help with anxiety and depression when dosed correctly, in tandem with CBD. It also works within the digestive system, possibly even better than like NSAIDs for like anti-inflammatory relief. If the right ratios were found with CBDA or CBD and terpenylene, you would have really excellent anti-inflammatory properties that also have no risk of gastric injury like you would with NSAIDs. In fact, it has been shown to the addition of terpenylene alongside of like diflinac was one study, actually decreased any previous gastric injury there. And then, of course, with digestion, we know that that is, sort of the first brain and how much that it controls mood and so many different other things in your body. There's just a lot of really therapeutic possibility with terpenylene if the right ratios are found, because it is such a intense high when in tandem with THC. You don't need a whole lot of it, and something that's super CBD rich and has a terpenylene dominance could really just take over the market. And so that'll be interesting to follow.
And so I have 3 last questions here, more at the higher level on your thought leadership kind of work. And the first is the big one about rethinking strain names. And you have an article about this on the subject. So you can tell us a little bit more about your views on that here?
Well, again, I think there's always going to be a place for having growers be able to sort of give their proprietary genetics fun and exciting names. The problem with that is that they're not always reliable sources of how a particular chemovarietal is going to affect you. Blue Dream is the constant example, but I will continue to use it just because it is such a widespread and well-known cultivation. You know, you could have Blue Dream seeds, of course, all having slightly genetic differences that then pop something completely new. But even if you're going to grow from clone, as soon as you take, 3 identical Blue Dream clones and put them in different environments, that's also, different kinds of light, different kinds of temperature, different kinds of soil, different kinds of pests, specifically pests and molds are going to change the way a particular effect might be when you actually consume it. So suddenly, you go into a shop, you say, hey, I have had Blue Dream in the past. It works really well for me. And hey, you have it on the shelf. I'd like to take that home. You take it home, and maybe it's not at all what you expected it to be because it's not coming from the same clone mother. It's not coming from the same farm. It's being grown differently. Maybe even the genetics aren't what they thought they were. And I don't want to get into genetics too much, but certainly if we could, we were all so excited by I'll just mention Phylos.
That's question number
Phylos
3.
Bioscience.
So please,
if
you want to explain more of that story, it's an important one.
It is an important one. We all got so excited, and I'm still excited about the idea of being able to determine if something is genetically what it says it is. It gives customers more confidence in what they're buying, and it's a great idea. The problem with the way that Phylos went about it was...
Could you explain a little bit just what how it initially started and the background to this?
Phylos, yeah. Yeah, so Phylos was a genetic testing company, is a genetic testing company, and they do sort of their bread and butter work with sex tests. So, being able to grow your plants up, a week old plant, you can turn in some material for them and they will tell you if it's going to be a male or a female, and suddenly you don't have to waste so much energy on the things that you don't want to keep. In addition to that, they were sourcing genetic material from growers throughout the United States and the world. They were getting genetic material from museums and landrace genetics and all kinds of things. They have tens of thousands of different genetic cultivations now listed on their website. They have this Phylos Galaxy, and it's actually really cool how things like interact, and you see, okay, this Corazon flower from Yerba Buena, this award-winning high CBD flower, is actually really just AC/DC, but it's a really good AC/DC, so it deserves its own name. It's good that it has its own name. But now we know it's an AC/DC, and people who liked AC/DC are probably going to like that. The problem is that in getting all of this genetic material from folks and using it to hopefully allow for some sort of record of proprietary genetics for the small craft growers, so that, should there ever come a time when they needed sort of patented material, they have at least a record of what they've done. The idea was that there was never ever going to be any sort of competitive breeding from Phylos. Well, we come to find out that, in fact, they do want to do breeding. And the idea from the owner's perspective was that they could do, they wanted to focus on hemp breeding so that they could really get healthy, better plants at a scale to which craft growers just simply can't. And that's great. That's wonderful. But they were doing this as sort of an investor pitch. And, just it became apparent that they did to some degree mislead the people that they had sourced genetics from, and that they were getting involved with some really big money that might be questionable. And so, people have sort of separated themselves from that at this point, because they were really misled and they felt very betrayed in terms of what was promised and what was delivered. And I still don't know if there was ever any real malintent there. But the fact remains, in this industry, honesty and transparency is paramount. No matter what part of this industry you're in, there's so much baggage that we still have to overcome that we cannot be crossing lines that could disrupt the community and disrupt trust. And that's exactly what Phylos has done, whether it was just through negligence or any sort of actual malintent. And so while Phylos might not be the best example in terms of where genetic testing is headed, in terms of the small grower, I do think it's a good component if we can do it right in terms of creating better and more reliable product. And it certainly did allow some growers to be able to use the data that they gave Phylos and then had access to on the Galaxy to help cycle through their own proprietary genetics at a much faster rate than they were ever able to do before, because they could test very quickly to see, okay, is this a line that I want to continue following, or do I want to follow this other line? Is this going to be more interesting? Is this going to be more medicinally beneficial? It has allowed folks to be able to kind of pinpoint what they really wanted to work on and focus on. But in terms of, going back to the strain name thing, I think it's a fun part of this industry. I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon, and I don't think it should. But ultimately, paired with whatever strain name is chosen, we need to be focusing on the phytochemistry, because that ultimately is the only thing that is important.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing.
Of course.
And actually, that last piece leads into my last question, because you're also an advocate for the standardization in the lab procedures around cannabis. Why is that such a big focus, and what are the problems out there right now that are happening that makes it be focused on?
You have a little bit of oversight for, labs. You have you have Oregon Health Authority and ORLAP sort of overseeing labs, but there's still at least a lot of talk of and reports of anecdotal reports of certain labs being a little bit more, a little less honest with the work that they're producing, whether that's driving up THC numbers, cherry picking, maybe reporting on terpenes that terpenes are tricky, just like cannabinoids. The more you have, it's very difficult to fine tune a machine to get all of the terpenes that and cannabinoids that you want to actually get. We're a long way from that. So, maybe you have a few labs out there over-reporting certain things, or just certain inconsistencies. I just think that there needs to be a standardized way of, okay, what cannabinoids are we measuring for? What terpenes are we measuring for across the board? Everybody, state to state, grow to grow, is all getting the same sort of data. It's the only way that we're going to be able to start using that data reliably, both customer facing and within the medical community. And I think we just need to get to a point where, there's just a little bit more oversight. Right now you have a bit of that, but you don't have enough people power behind it to fully implement any sort of oversight, at least here in Oregon. I think a lot of things fall through the cracks. And, as more states come online and as there is federal regulation, you'll probably see more of that. There will be more standardization. But I think it's where we need to go. It's where we need to look towards if we're going to have any sort of reliable data to use at our disposal to talk to people that are looking for specific things, or to growers who are looking to go a certain direction as they continue to experiment with genetics.
Amen. Well, Andrea, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Oh, my pleasure. It was so wonderful chatting with you, Lex.
And so people can come up and see you when they're in the neighborhood, come to Farma.
Oh, yes, please do. Please do. I'm there Monday through Friday. But honestly, anybody there can answer questions. We try to make sure that everybody stays abreast of what's going on. I keep a huge database of up and coming research and articles and so on and so forth. And we do weekly education sessions. So the staff is very knowledgeable. And I definitely want to see, in addition to standardization of labs, I want to see standardization of education and get people, sort of unite the kingdom, so to speak, and get everybody on board, no matter where they're working from.
Wow, that sounds great. Well, thank you so much again for the time. We'll link to your writings and such in the episode notes, and we look forward to hearing more next time we get to talk.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com/Lex Files. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com. If you enjoyed the program, please rate us on iTunes and share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, maker of America's favorite CBD oil. And remember the coupon code LEXFILES. I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.